Good evening, everybody. It's been a full day. I want to thank everyone for being here and present and welcome those that are new in this space. And it's been a heavy day. I think we've been, discussing topics that should raise concern to recognize the crisis and the depths of that crisis that we're facing. And to know, though, the struggles, we watched those videos in the middle of the day, seeing the fights that people are making all over this country, and knowing that we are here to do something about what's going on, right? And we're here to take that seriously and to really feel the gravity of this moment that we're in and make the commitment that's needed to move forward. And we know we're not quite there yet, but we know that justice is coming, right? We know that we are part of making justice possible. And so I wanted to start us out this evening, and I'm gonna need some help from you all. You know how we do. To lift up our voices and calling out justice to be here, to hold on just a little while longer, because we know that justice is coming. We know it's coming, and it's coming soon, right? So I'm going to ask you all to stand if you're able with me. And we are starting a little slower tonight, because we want to take in what we've heard all day today. We want to be here and present with each other. And feel your neighbor next to you. And actually, if you all want to, are we going to block the live stream if we kind of fill in? I feel like I need a little bit more of a crossing the aisle. We have a divide here. Yeah, there you go. All right. And you can sing this with me. Hold on just a little while longer. Hold on just a little while longer. Hold on just a little while longer. I know justice is coming soon. Hold on just a little while longer. Hold on just a little while longer. Hold on just a little while longer. I know justice is coming soon. Pray on just a little while longer. Pray on just a little while longer. Pray on just a little while longer. I know justice is coming soon. March on just a little while longer. March on just a little while longer. March on just a little while longer. I know justice is coming soon. Fight on just a little while longer. Fight on just a little while longer. Fight on just a little while longer. I know justice is coming soon. Sing on, raise those voices. Sing on, just a little while longer. Sing on, just a little hang on just a little while longer. I know justice is coming soon. Hold on, just a little while longer. Hold on, just a little while longer. Hold on, just a little while longer. I know justice is coming soon. Hold on, just a little while longer. Hold on, just a little while longer. Hold on, just a little while longer. I know justice is coming soon. I know justice is coming soon. I know justice is coming soon.
Amen. Amen. All right. Amen.
Good evening. Oh, we could do better than that. Good evening.
Good evening.
Can you hear me though? Not so good. Maybe is it not on?
Push it.
All right. There we go. You have to turn it on for it to be on. Just learning a couple things.
That's right.
Learn something every
So
day.
now, good evening. Good evening. So my name is Reverend Dr. Liz Theo Harris, and I am the director of the Cairo Center and the co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, and it is powerful to be with you all this evening. Let's hear it for the campaign. We are living in a moment where we have so-called faith leaders masking hypocrisy, violence, and lies. And so we're gathered here to battle this out at this convening about the battle of the Bible, taking on Christian nationalism, and taking it on as we fight systemic racism and poverty, ecological devastation, and this militarism and war economy. I get to introduce the folks that are joining this conversation this evening, and as I do so, I want to bring a couple of words myself. I was reading the Bible, as I like to do as a New Testament scholar, and came upon Galatians 1, a text that has been used actually against many communities for a long time, where Paul says, "I'm astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you to live in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel," which is really no gospel at all. Evidently, some people are throwing you into confusion and are trying to pervert the gospel of Christ. If anybody is preaching to you a gospel other than what is one of justice, let us be under God's curse. As folks may be aware, the word gospel in Greek is evangelion, the root of evangelical. It means good news, and there's nowhere in our New Testament texts where good news is separated from bringing good news to the poor.
All right.
Jesus starts his inaugural sermon in Luke saying, "The Spirit of God is upon me. He has anointed me to bring good news, evangelion, the gospel, to the poor, to bind up the brokenhearted, to release to the captives, proclaim the year of God's remission of debts. Matthew only has about 5 mentions of the word gospel, and everyone is about righteousness and justice and caring for the poor and organizing society around the needs of everyone. And so when Paul talks about another evangelical, another gospel that really is not a gospel of good news to the poor, perhaps he's speaking to our world today. When we have so-called faith leaders willing to come out in support of injustice, willing to come out and explain that God wants to build up walls, saying that we should have work requirements for health care, saying that we should take off protections of water because it's going to be in the interests of us all. These are serious times. We go back to times in history when there have been gatherings of this sort, where you had slaveholders who were producing a Bible that didn't have the Exodus, didn't have the prophets, and didn't have any good news to the poor. But you had Harriet Moses Tubman and other leaders saying that righteousness and justice is the work of God. This evening, I have the honor of introducing some of the prophets of our day who are taking on this Christian nationalism, who are battling out heretical theology that blames people for the problems that our structures of society have caused and tries to tell us that we should just settle for less. First, we're going to have Wenzel Nosey, who is leading the struggle at Oak Flat, former chair of the San Carlos Apache, leader in the Apache stronghold, and really a prophet of our day, bringing truth and light and spirit to struggle. After Wenzel, we'll have Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove, who heads up the School of Conversion, is a founding member of Red Letter Christians, who are talking about what the Bible really says about issues of justice and injustice and truth. And we'll also hear from Reverend Dr. William Barber II, co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, president and senior lecturer of Repairers of the Breach, architect of the Forward Together Moral Mondays movement out of North Carolina. And then we'll get to engage in some conversation. The Bible is many things. It's also one of the only forms of mass media that proclaims justice and righteousness for all who are oppressed. We cannot concede this to folks who have white supremacy, white nationalism, U.S. exceptionalism, neoliberal economics at their core. We have to engage in this battle for the Bible. And there's no better way to do it than with these leaders. So I introduce Wenzel Nosey.
First of all, I just want to thank Reverend Barber, Reverend Liz for having this opportunity. The reason why I say the opportunity is because I believe we have never been ever at the table when it comes to the discussion of religion in this country. And as you can see, over 500 years, it's been a long time. And I'm very grateful. I think one of the biggest mistakes ever made in this country was trying to define in the English language, what our religion was, but then again, blast us with names that, took us away from what religion was and really outcast us into somebody that we were not, and caused, great fear in this country of who we were, as we were pagans or, ones without a God and didn't know what we were doing. A lot of this didn't make any sense to us because, we felt like our religion is no different than anybody else's religion from across the country, and across the world. But anyway, I just really want to give thanks, and also to our Creator for giving, I think, the world an opportunity now, giving the world a path, a journey that we all must follow. I tell my children that it's no different than anything that you do. You have to modify and readjust to be able to reach the needs of what's happening around you. And I think in life it's no different. We have to adjust. And times in life, it gives us that opportunity to do that. And where we feel is that we're in that time where an adjustment has to be made, which is really, really crucial to every one of us. And to us, that's the spiritual journey that must take place, because we're all in one pot. I guess, for me, I would say in the very beginning, forgive me. I apologize, because the things I'm going to say is not to hurt anyone or to step on anyone's feet. But I think what I'm going to say is what should have been told in the very beginning, before anyone ever stepped foot on this part of the world. In the Indian belief, we have 4 sacred mounds. But then in the beginning, that makes reference to the way the Mother Earth sits. And they talk about night and day. And at that time, because we had the daylight and night would come, we knew people were on the other side of the world. But because of the way it was structured, there was no really communication of how people travel today. But in that time, our people talk about a person, there's a jokester. He's a person that's a gambler. And in that time, he had already came here. And in that given time, the people here were very religious to the way creation is, the way the world was created. And so what we say is that through the spiritual belief and the spiritual power of that time, the people were able to gather, and they say it in a way that they shot an arrow and it nicked him. And so he knew at that time that he could not conquer on this side of the world. And so his last words to the people on this side of the world was to turn back and, sarcastically say to us, "I will be back," and laugh. And so in this process, what we have learned is that from the English side of things is that we knew him as a jokester, a conniver, everything that's related to that. But what we have learned is that he's what you guys call Lucifer. He has already been here, the person who deceit and, will gamble. And so he had threatened the people here on this side of the world that he will be back. And this is why earlier what I said to you, that we don't hate white people or anybody who's here. It's the thing that you brought. So in this 500 years, we have set back trying to define who this evil is. Who is this person that now has come here to this side of the world to destroy exactly what he did on the other side of the world. And so now it's here. And so what's really important for us as Native people is that we're able to stick a face to that so that people can know who you're dealing with. You have to know who you're dealing with. And that's why it's so important for, as I said before, the Native people come to the table, because you need us to understand what is happening here today, because that is the first chapter of how America was created, from deceiving the people, deceiving you. And so like I tell the younger people is that when we talk about decolonize, it's not just us. It's everybody has to become decolonized and understand the concepts that you live in, understand what is those forces that are keeping you where you're at. That's why earlier I mentioned that when I had the opportunity to cover this country and visit so many different denominations, races. And my last words to my people back home was that I don't think these people that call these places towns and cities, that they understand they're living like us on reservations. Because they are limited, from what they are taught, from what they are told, and what they are shown. And then the propaganda, as far as to keep you in those places, continues strongly, and then we embrace that. Because one of the things that we see that has happened here is that you are no different than I am in having huge families. But when you're living in a corporate world, it starts to dwindle your family to where there's only a few, but yet there's many of you because of what it does to you. And so there's a total disconnect that happens to the family. Then you lose the family base. You lose that rooted base. So it's like a mirage. It's there, then it disappears. Because it's not concreted into the Mother Earth, Mother. We don't pray to the earth as it's God. We pray to it as though it's a part of us. It's our mother who cares for us. Just like how you would pray or care for your mother, your sister. No different. And then we understand that we have to live with these things. We are intertwined together. There's no way we can live without each other. And so when you go back to the beginning of time, like I tell people, is that if we go back to the beginning, there's a lot of connections that we have. A lot of connections. Because at that time, we understood what God's creations were and the purpose for those things. So as we say, when the newcomers came, it's like you take a pond, a sterile pond, you drop a pebble, and then the first rings are created, the second rings are created, a third. Well, what we say is that the first ring was a deception. That was the lie of this country. And then as it ringed out, more rings started to form. But every other ring came under that deception. And so it's really important that we go back to the first chapter of how these places were founded. Because you can go back to your cities, your towns, and your government, and they always talk about the founding fathers. Well, they're talking about stockholders. They're talking about people who control the country. And then they educate their children. And then it's installing their children to keep away from people like us. Because we come with a different mind, which should be the journey of the spirit of life and the giver of life and our purpose to help maintain what God created. But it disconnects us from that. And when that happens, then they're winning the battle. And so when all this is happening and we're listening and we're learning and we're following, and we sit back and we say, in their language, he's this person they call Lucifer, who has many names, because it's playing with every one of us. And I think, for me, that's one of the things that's really important of why we need to be at the table, why we need to be involved in this transition that's going to take place, in this new social way, this new religious way. It's a gift from God. It's already been there. It didn't go anywhere. We're the ones that detached ourselves from it, and we have to come back to it. Because if we're going to save anything, that's really what's left. It comes back to us individually. That's why I told you the first healing comes back to looking at ourselves. Because the greatest gift God gave you is your body, is you. And what you do in your teaching, your mind, your heart, your soul, reaching out there. That's what's so, so important. So I think that, being here today, being here tonight and being with you is a time that's been long awaited. Over 500 years suffering of our people. And I guess I would kind of end with this, and I know we're going to be talking more, but my mother used to tell me, she used to say, son, at one time they were supposed to annihilate us from the face of the earth, because the federal policy was to exterminate all of us. And 90% of our people in America got exterminated. Only 10%, this is what is here today, 10% from that time. And what she told me, she says, son, she's talking about the first wave, did all this deceptions, but it was the second and third wave, and she's making a reference to children, that they said, this is wrong. This is wrong, what we're doing to the first people. So she says, so son, we're in a time now that you have to go find those people, because those people had children like themselves and should have taught them the right words of God. So you have to find them now, because they're out there, and if they all come together, then we definitely are going to save what's left. But most importantly, our children. Because if we don't teach our children any of these things, then we're not doing what we should be doing. Because the tomorrow is our children. And if we can teach our children what they should know, then they're going to teach their children. And then the world will change. So it's sad. We're all dirty already because we've touched this corporate way. But we have to recognize it so that we can begin to limit ourselves and then begin to look for true healing. And so, those things are really important, and as we move forward, as the way we see it, because we're all in this together. We're fighting something great. And that's why when we come here or when we leave, we pray for all of you, because we say to ourselves, like, who doesn't know who they're fighting evil? By fighting these fights and standing for these issues, like it's told to us, it's coming 2, 3, 4 times strong against you to keep you from being a part of the healing. Because if it comes after you, then we lose you in the battle. And that's why it's so important that we keep on the spiritual trail.
That's right. That's right.
Because if we keep that spiritual trail, we have gone further than any of the ones before us. But we have to appreciate what they went through, because now we're in that time where we need to understand. There's no excuse for us to not understand. It's time that we all work together. And that's why I'm so grateful that I can sit at the table tonight. And I know in the very beginning when I met Reverend Barber in D.C., that's when when I said that now there is hope. I do feel hope for the first time to see my granddaughter stand with me and hear the moral commitment of the Poor People's Campaign that these are the issues and we need to address. And so I know with Indian country, you have us, if that's the road. And that has to be the road, because we're fighting something greater than us. That's but right. We have to understand it. And if we do, then we finally put a face to that evil. And now, because it's recognized, it goes backwards. And that's how we say the mother, Nago-san, will begin the healing. And it will heal, because now the people are back to what they should be. So again, just for my opening remarks, I really want to thank you for the opportunity for listening, at least giving me the opportunity to listen to the way we were brought up and what we see and what we feel and what we worry about when we look at you. Because you've been in it longer than we have. And all we're trying to do is tell you what we see. It's not for you to get offended by it, but it's for you to see the road you're on, because we're going down that road too. And we have to catch ourselves and say, whoa, wait a minute, this is not the road that it was intended to be.
That's right.
So I'll leave you there.
That's right. That's right.
Well, I'd like to begin by saying what an honor it is to be with you, and to thank you for the courage with which you are fighting for me and for my people. I think it's an incredibly important gift, and certainly not one we deserve, so thank you. I grew up in the church in North Carolina, the Baptist church, and two things the Baptists who raised me were very committed to: the Bible and religious freedom. We had to memorize the Bible growing up.
Yes.
We memorized it in the King James Version. So it was good enough for Jesus, it was good enough for us. That's how we talked about it. But one thing that stays with me is these texts. So Liz read, led by the Spirit that unites us all, Liz read from Galatians chapter 1, where let's talk about this other gospel. And then you were sharing, I think, a deep insight about the role that the deceiver has played in this shared history that we've all inherited here. That passage in Galatians 1 goes on to say, who has bewitched you? Who has deceived you, O foolish Galatians? Paul is talking to people in that time, in that place, but I'm here as a foolish Galatian, I want to say. A foolish Galatian who was deceived along with my people. And I think what I can testify to a little bit here is how I've had to learn both how that deception happened and what is needed to be free from it. So I grew up in the Southern Baptist Church in North Carolina in the 1980s and 90s, when there was a very concerted effort by people who were very, very opposed to the civil rights movement and the women's rights movement and the human rights movement of the 1960s and 70s. They formed a political movement called the New Right, and that political movement was trying to find a coalition of voters who could keep the people who had been in power, the people who had gained power through deception, right, in power. And they realized that there was an incredible force in the civil rights movement and the moral leadership of that movement that that threatened that power in the same way that the abolitionists and the social gospel movement and other movements had done that in the past. And they realized that appealing to racism, which had been, a huge part of this nation's history, in a direct way was not going to work anymore in the South where I'm from. But if you could convince people that what they used to believe in because they believed in racial superiority was in fact their religion, it was their values, then you could persuade them to keep the same people in power. And that message was sold to my people with organizations and lots of money. Mm-hmm. I didn't know that's what was happening to us at the time, but I have come to learn that we were being deceived. And I grew up in that as a person who was trying to be a sincere person of faith and wanted to do all that I could for Jesus, and so I was trying to become a politician for Jesus. And so I got very involved in the religious right. I was kind of trained up as a foot soldier in this this culture war that we were told was being waged, that there were people who were trying to take away our values, take away our religion. And here's the other part of being Baptist. They started telling us that people were trying to take away our religious freedom. And for Baptists, there's a long history of recognizing that the state can use its power to take away religion. That's why people like Roger Williams and John Leland in the early colonial period started talking about this idea of religious freedom that found its way into the Constitution, because they had the experience of theocratic governments that told some people they were wrong for what they believed, and therefore they couldn't practice their belief, they couldn't speak freely about their beliefs. That was passed down to us too. But you see, it was turned against itself, right, to deceive us. So our Bible and our commitment to religious freedom, religious liberty was turned against itself, and that was the only story I knew. So I got quite involved in conservative politics. I went to Page for Senator Strom Thurmond, who was from South Carolina and had been a segregationist, had been the person who led the segregationists from the Southern Democratic Party into the Republican Party, and yet had held on to power in this transition from sort of an explicitly racist politics to a politics that appealed to values and religion. And the thing that I'm grateful for, and what I hear as I listen to you, is that in the heart of true religion, there is always a connection with the sacred, a connection with the divine that is in the creation and is in every person. And the people who raised me, though we had been deceived, had passed enough of that on to me that I recognized when I saw what was happening that this was not what the Sunday school teachers had talked about, right? This was not true religion. but I didn't know there was any alternative, right? The deception was so wrapped around us in the literature that we received, in the radio stations that we listened to, in the television. They had created this whole world in which this was the only narrative. And so I'm here today as a witness that, as someone who came from that place and someone who was deceived, as someone who was part of a people who had been deceived, we weren't entirely deceived, right? Mm-hmm. There was still some truth there. And when I was able to recognize that there was something wrong, there was another way of reading the Bible in this country. And I learned it from that man on the other end here. When I came back to North Carolina, convinced that I could no longer be, a religious right Christian for the Republican Party, I went looking for another way to be Christian. And I met this preacher from North Carolina who talked about the same Bible, believed in religious liberty, sang the same hymns that I had grown up singing, but was able to read that tradition with all of these justice and freedom movements that have challenged this deception that you were talking about. And so my hope in the moment that we're living in now is that as so many people are disillusioned by the obvious hypocrisy of the way faith is being abused in our public life, that might not simply lead to a cynicism, right? That says, religion is bad, we have no hope, but rather we might realize what Frederick Douglass said in the 19th century, that, there's a great difference between the Christianity of the slaveholder and the Christianity of Christ. There's a great difference between, religion that is weaponized in order to divide people and keep the powerful, in the places of power, and the faith that you're talking about. And so I just want to celebrate what you're doing, and for those who were here earlier and heard more about Oak Flat, to give thanks for Winslow Nosey, who I think is the greatest single example of the principle of religious liberty that Baptists passed on to me, right? Though you're from a different tradition, you're bringing this wisdom from a different place than I'm familiar with, it resonates with me, right? It resonates with that question of who has deceived you that I learned in the Bible. And you're making the connection brilliantly that there is a deceiver in your tradition and in ours, and that deceiver has blinded a lot of us. And we need folks like you to lead us into a new way, and that's why I'm really grateful to be part of this Poor People's Campaign with you. So thank you very much.
So I want to stand up just a little bit, and I want to again, and Jonathan, you said something, I'm trying to get my memory correct. Did Frederick Douglass say the religion of the slaveholder and the Christianity of Christ? Yeah. I think he said religion. The reason I'm saying that, he refused to call what they were doing Christianity.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
But he had to acknowledge it was religion because it was what they were putting their trust in. Now I want to say something about that. Jonathan, I'm so honored to be with you, and Jonathan keeps me from being cynical. And we are kind of on a lifelong evangelistic quest about redemption, trying to reach many of the people that I grew up with, that he grew up with, that have been deceived. We ourselves had our own deceptions. I can tell you early on in my life, if it wasn't for my father, I was around a religion that would not have put me where I am today. Even though many of my people were good, they were clear on some forms of civil rights. But interestingly, even as African American, I grew up in a place where people shunned getting involved in the political sphere, and to some degree, and for a lot of reasons. Some of it was self-protection because they didn't want the churches blown up. Mm-hmm. They didn't want to be hurt, so they chose to be apolitical, because it is dangerous when you mess with Lucifer. And I know all you modernists might not talk about the devil and Lucifer, but I've seen enough evil to know somebody behind it. I'm just, this ain't just something that's just happening. Right, so, that in that sense, I'm still my old orthodox conservative self. So I'm thankful, Jonathan, for that. You know, even for me at 12 years old, I thought I was going to have to kill at least 2 white people because the Klan had burned a cross in front of my uncle's yard who had married a white woman, and they beat up his son, and they burned his cross, and my uncle simply came to me with a 12-gauge shotgun loaded with buckshot and what we call slugs that was used to kill bear. Said, go to the back door, kill anything that moves. The next thing I heard him unloading toward the Klan. And I thought at 12 years old I was probably going to have to commit a murder. Or not a murder, I was going to have to kill somebody. And for trying to come in our house. And it left me with some deep scars toward white people. So, you know, I had to recover from some deep hatred, right? Even though I'm white, Tuscaroran, and African American. Even though I have families members of my family that looks like anybody in here, blue-eyed, blonde hair, that came north and passed. And so God has always put me kind of in relationship with the other to save me from the cynicism that could have been mine from early on. And of course, I met Brother Winsler, and I really feel in some sense he is America's Gandhi in this moment. When Gandhi said, I'm gonna walk, I don't know who's coming with me, but I'm gonna be free, and I'm going down and I'm gonna start taking this salt. Alone, if necessary. And Brother Winsler in some ways is that. And a lot of our struggles start with lone individuals acting in corporate ways. Lone individuals acting in ways that affect the whole. And of course, Liz, I really don't think, and I don't say this just because she's here, but I would say that any seminary that does not have people reading her book on the poor and what the Bible really says about the poor is under training its preachers. And I mean that because that piece needs to be read. Now I just want to make some glancing comments and then read you something. John and our relationship is strange. You know, I called him 3 o'clock in the morning and said, Doc, I just thought of something. And of course he doesn't answer me till early the next morning. But it'll be about 5 o'clock when I'm getting my sleep before I get up at 6, that he'll ring my phone and say, well, what is it you were thinking about? And I'll see it. And we talk through, and then we write these articles, because I'm on the road running, so he's like kind of my Baruch. Jeremiah had a writer. And I'll call him and I'll drop up, like I said, I want to do this paragraph like this, and this is the history, and this is this. And he'll say, okay. And then he'll say, what do you think about this? So I want to read something, but then I want to just make some broad strokes here. First of all, it is important that in this work we're doing, that we don't become what we hate. I can't get out of my spirit. The first time I met Brother Nodes, he said, if this remains spiritual, right? And even so much to recently, I've been trying to put away the word anger from my vocabulary, even though I know I got biblical text, be anger, sin. But when he told me how the Apache people really don't have words for certain things because it's connected to the evil, right? So I'm trying to say things like, I love folks so much that I hurt when they disappoint me. I'm trying to say it differently. Not that I'm angry with them, or because he reminded us that the first people said they don't even use that word. When people start using words like that, I think I heard him say they kind of back away. Now we have been taught that indigenous people were angry. They were cutting off folks' scalp. That's what we did. And I say we because there was even some black buffalo soldiers. We the ones started cutting people's hair and heads off and all that kind of craziness. So we have to, in this movement, and I say this to the people in the Poor People's Campaign, because from time to time we'll get some folk that just want us to say, if you would just stop being preachers, you and Liz, and stop doing all this moral stuff, well, find another movement. Now we're not anti-folk who, that doesn't mean everybody has to be Christian or Jewish. There are plenty of people here that may not or may not believe, and that's your truth. But for this country and this world, for us, we are not at the place that we think we can do this on our own. We actually are at the place that we believe if we try doing this on our own, we will become what we're fighting against, because we don't have the spiritual inner strength to resist that by ourselves. Right? Second thing is, every campaign that has ever engaged to lift up people, poor people's campaigns have always had a moral center. That's the second point, some deep moral center. The third point is, Liz said something when she was talking, when she said, the Bible is the greatest form of mass media that puts justice, lifting up the least of these, and dealing with the poor at the center. There's no other mass media that does it as quick, as clear. Because I mean, of course, you could say other holy books, but since we're talking about the Bible is a great form of mass media, which means you cannot have genocide against indigenous people, enslave people for 400 years, kill a whole lot of them before they even get here to be enslaved, because you drop them in the water by the millions, and the sharks follow the ships and eat them when you throw them off. You cannot create a constitution that dismisses poor white folk and women, right? You cannot create a whole system of segregation and discrimination. You cannot do that. You cannot use fake wars to take Mexico lands if this form of mass media is taught in its proper form.
That's right. That's right.
Now, there's a scripture in the Bible that says that the evil one is the prince of the air. And air in that sense means communication. So it should not surprise us that there's a battle for the Bible, right? And that joker, right, inspired folk to say, you have to do this. You ever seen the movie about what's it, the Denzel played in Eli, the book of Eli? You know, yeah. The sense that this book, if taught properly, is a major challenge. And so to do all the things we've seen, there had to be either a destruction of it outright or a hijacking. And the forces of injustice chose to hijack it from the beginning, from the very beginning. Another point I want to just make, and these are just rough points, and in order to hijack it, even if you hijack a plane, you have to be well funded. Hijackers are always connected to some money. They had to somehow have enough resources to get around all of the protective systems to get in to do the hijacking. So it should not surprise us that there's been a lot of money put into destroying the religion of indigenous people and destroying the truth and justice that comes up out of the scripture in order to take something that was meant for justice and righteousness and use it to actually undergird injustice, take some resources. And in this country, we can't, I hope we are not getting excited about this because of what Trump and his evangelicals are doing, because it was long before him. In 1935, when Roosevelt was trying to pass the New Deal, even though it had its racial overturns, and songs were being sung from Riverside Church like "Who Will Go and Lift the Poor" and the social gospel that came out of New York and Walter Rauschenbusch was at its height. The corporations of this world, of this country, said the companies said we need a way to steer a moral narrative away from the New Deal, but we've lost any power we have because we ran the country into a depression. They did a poll and found out that the churches still had a certain level of moral influence, and so they said, what corporations always do, how do we purchase it? And Kevin Cruz, in his book, One Nation Under God, The Purchasing of the Christian Pulpit, says that they called a guy from California and gave him millions of dollars, Sun Oil, the National Chamber of Commerce. They met right here in New York, right here at the Waldorf Astoria. They met right here. And he said, look, if you give me such and such amount of money, I will have you at least 10,000 pulpits in a few years. And he actually ended up with something like 20,000. And all of that funding and undergirding set in place motion for what we would see later, the moral majority, all that stuff, right? But it came from slaveholder religion that also had, for every pharaoh has to have paid magicians. Every Caesar has to have court chaplains. Every Rome has to stop a poor people's movement led by a brown-skinned Palestinian and take it over and make it the religion of the state. Every one of them. Every king that's unjust has to have false prophets. And they have to be paid well. Right? So I just wanted to kind of get those glancing things. Then I want to do something, since this is a Bible conference, I want to read the Bible. And in Malachi chapter 3, because I may not say anything else after this about what I have to say, in Malachi chapter 3, there's a verse in verse 4, and this is the Message Bible. It says, who will be able to stand up to the coming of the Lord and at God's appearance? Because these folk were like, come Lord, come Lord, come Lord. But they were the people doing all the oppressing. And so God said, wait a minute, you really might not want me to show up. I don't care how many churches you got around in Temple, you all really might not want me to show up. And it was interesting that Liz went to Galatians, and then Jonathan talked about bewitching. Paul actually was also pulling that from Old Testament scriptures. Because Paul, in the Old Testament scriptures, it says God's going to come like hot fire from the smelter's furnace and like lye soap. Now, who is he going to do? He's going to put that fire and the soap on the preachers. That's right. In the pulpits who have lied to the people. And because they have lied to the people, he says, I got to refine, I got to purge the preacher crew. And by the way, the choir members too, the Levites. I got to purge all of them that's singing and praying, but they're not doing. They're singing and preaching, but they're not doing justice. So I got to purge them. And then it says, I'm visiting you with just judgment. And here's the judgment. You have messed with sorcerers. And sorcerers in this text has a political overtone. It means those who have spellbound the people to the point that they can go in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody nobody would. I mean, I'm just saying. That's what a sorcerer in this text means, those who have spellbound, who have deceived, who have lied, who and it's like, and you try to figure out why are they so crazy, why they want to hurt everybody, why they want to take folks' health care, why they want to go on people's holy land and just destroy it. They're under a spell. But it's not some weird thing out there. He who is the speller, the ultimate person that works spell, has got some folk that he's lent enough power. If folk listen to him long enough, they get, let me make a word, sorcerized. They got a spell on them. Then he says, judgment will also be against the adulterers. And adulterers in this text means those who leave the way of justice and play the whore with injustice. Those who leave the way of peace and play the whore with war. Those who leave the way of love and play the whore with hate. That's what adultery here means. It's in political overtone. And then he says, because they are sorcerized and they're playing the whore with truth, he says, guess what they do? They exploit workers. They don't pay them a living wage. Y'all didn't know this was in the Bible, did you? It's right in the Bible. Huh? The explanation for what's going on right here. They exploit workers. They take advantage of women and children that are homeless and poor. And they make their nation inhospitable to immigrants. That came straight out of the Bible. Straight out of the Bible. Malachi says, he says, and to do all of those things is proof that there's a sorcery at work. That is proof that somebody committing adultery and playing adultery with hate, as I said, rather than being in love with love. And it produces this. And Malachi says, until these things are rectified, I must purge the preachers and the religious places because the religion has become a supporter of these things. The religion has been, now you, and therefore it is impure. Malachi says, it is not Judaism. It is not Christianity. It is an impurity. It is a virus. It is the result of bad medicine. And you need to know that if you're going to deal with it. And we're not only talking spooky stuff, we're talking what's real. You need to know that. It's deep. And some folk have been convinced that racism is not just a sociological category, but it's their religion. And they'll die for it. They'll rob the country for it. They'll steal elections for it. They'll commit genocide for it. And it ain't new. This picture we saw with Trump could have been taken any time in American history. That's what this article is about. The early fathers had their preachers that told them having a constitution that starts with the establishment of justice and still having slaves and not letting women vote was okay. They just didn't have cameras to take them. Jefferson Davis had his own form of evangelical, and they are evangelicals. They just ain't Christian evangelicals. Because they do try to win. And they believe what they're teaching is good news, and it is to them.
That's right.
You know, being able to abuse folk and not pay a living wage is good news to greedy folk. Not giving people health insurance, it is good news, at least temporarily. Because what they don't realize is the deceiver, the jokester, he really wants it all. But he got to fool enough people to think by doing what they're doing, they're saving themselves. And they don't even realize they're destroying their own self. I'm going to stop here and say one more thing. Your daughter preached to me yesterday, Brother Winslow. We were at the UN. And I'm going to give y'all this article. I may read some of it later. But this is my last comment. When she said, I hadn't heard this. She said, Reverend Barber, now they put a rider on a defense bill to drill at Oak Flats. She said, you may not know this. She said there are 5 minerals out there at Oak, for 4 or 5, that have critical use in the development of weaponry. Right? So they're greedy, thinking we give this rider, let these multinational corporations come in, they kick back the money, whoever they kick it back to, because it's getting kicked to somebody. Nobody does this stuff just for fun, y'all. So there's some money somewhere at the root of it, at the root of all evil, some money. But in doing so, they are actually now making America even more of a target to be hit. So that old joker got them fooled. If we can take these folks' land and dig this stuff up, we can make all this money and be safe. When actually now by doing that and discovering it and uncovering it and not letting it be holy, and nobody know about that stuff under there, maybe that's the reason it was holy. God said, let me cover this with some holiness. You're going to uncover it with unholiness and end up making yourself a target, which could lead to all our destruction. Because pride always cometh before destruction. And what is racism and greed but pride and idolatry and self-worship? And so the battle's been on a long time. We're just the latest ones. But in the battle, God help us, in the battle, let us not become what we battle. That's why we too have to, that's why even when you call other folks out, you can't get up any day of your life, for me, I say this and I believe it, and have your own prayer of repentance. One of the great prophets who was actually doing the right thing had to pray, Lord, I'm a sinner. And I know progressive folk don't like that word. But we've all in some way been touched by that joker. We've all got a nick. So he got up and said, I'm a sinner, and I live in the midst of an unclean nation. And because he was able to own his own, he then was qualified to call out the sin of the nation. Right? So let's keep on battling.
So I want to keep us on this topic in particular of the connection between racism, white supremacy, and greed and economic injustice as it relates to this issue of Christian nationalism, of heretical theology, right? So I'm going to start with you, Jonathan, in part because I know you have to run out soon so you don't miss a plane. But you were talking about how there was this move from kind of racist politics to family values. And I was wondering if you could kind of speak about, at the core of nationalism is white supremacy, but how it's often cloaked in some of these other theological, ways.
Yeah, yesterday was the March for Life in Washington, D.C., which is a gathering point for many of the organizations that have worked to push Christian nationalism. And it's a representation of the original argument that they chose, right? So to try to hold political power without appearing to be racist, the New Right advised Jerry Falwell and others who started the Moral Majority to talk about being pro-life.
That's right.
And to connect that to family values, right? Windsor was just telling us how anti-family this whole deception is, right? This is a system that has literally been separating families as long as it's existed. But by talking about the religious values as pro-family and pro-life, they hoped to give people a sense that they were standing up for something that's good and righteous. And there's a historian named Randall Balmer who has gone back and I think hopefully shown that if you go back and look at the varied faith communities that were initially sort of targeted to do this organizing, I'm talking about folks like the community I grew up in, Southern Baptists in the South, and Independent Baptists. In 1973, when Roe v. Wade was passed, these groups had a wide range of views on the issue, in the places where it was commented on. But by and large, it was not a central issue for them.
That's right.
Right? And so what was the central issue? If you go back to the 1970s and look at what these groups were talking about, they were very concerned about the role that the federal government had in trying to desegregate public schools. And all of these churches were talking about the danger of the Brown decision and the danger of its enforcement to their communities, to the point that they were using their church buildings to start these independent Christian academies that were segregation academies. They could pull their kids out of the public school, send them over to the church, and they could get a quote-unquote safe pro-family education that kept them away from the black kids. Mm-hmm. It was a direct defiance of Brown and of the enforcement of Brown by the federal government. But when the IRS cracked down on that practice, and certainly it began in the Nixon administration, but it was under Jimmy Carter when they refused to accept the reapplication of these academies for nonprofit status. That was when these advisors, these political advisors from the New Right, went to Jerry Falwell and said, "You have an outraged base. You can mobilize them around this. Call it pro-life." Mm-hmm. So it has absolutely nothing to do with concern for children.
Right.
It has everything to do with being angry at the IRS for not letting you get away with explicit racism. And so I think that deception that we've been talking about. So recognizing that helped me to see how much we had been deceived. My grandfather was a dirt farmer from North Carolina who went to Bible college and became a Baptist preacher. I preached his funeral, and when we got his stuff out of his house, I went into the little desk where he prepared his sermons in his house, and he had a picture of Jerry Falwell right there above the desk. So this was an attempt to tell us that our well-being was somehow tied up with this deception, and a lot of us believed it because it was the story that was being told. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think, and it was a using, because the money behind it simply wanted that base, so that they could, if they put pro-life out there, which, by the way, if you ever notice, they never quote scripture. They never say this is a Jesus position. I mean, they may find one or two scriptures, in the Old Testament or something like that, but they never really lay it out in Jesus' sermons and say, we're doing this because Jesus said, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to be against women's rights, and they just can't find it. So they can't put it on Jesus. They may find a text here or there, but those texts don't override, and Liz would say, the power of Jesus' quote unquote red letter. Even Paul has to be evaluated through Jesus' red letter if you're talking about Christianity. That's why I say you can be an evangelical, just don't call it Christian. But what we also know is those folk that had the money knew if we could get people riled up behind that, then we could a candidate could be doing anything else. Touching women, giving tax cuts that's gonna hurt the very poor people, blocking health care, as long as you can throw out there, boop, that they're pro-life. You can put judges on the bench that are really more, if you look at their rulings, 70, 75, 80% of their decisions is about the corporations.
Yeah.
As long as you claim that judge will probably be pro-life, might never, ever, ever, ever vote to overturn Roe. That's not the point. The point is just like it was when it was race. If you could, like for instance, let me read this real quick. When segregationist George Wallace faced the moral challenge of Dr. Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement in the 1960s Alabama, he called upon religious leaders to vouch for him. By no stretch of the imagination is George Wallace a racist. Dr. Henry L. Lyon, the pastor of Montgomery Highland Avenue Baptist Church, testified. He has shown fairness to all people regardless of race or color. The Reverend R.L. Lawrence, a Methodist minister, concurred. They were vouching for the same Wallace who had infamously declared in his inaugural address, segregation yesterday, today, and tomorrow, and they declared Wallace was the righteous one and King was the agitator. And it didn't matter whatever else Wallace did as long as he was in segregation. Night before last in Augusta, in the Grace Episcopalian Church, I stood in the pulpit on top of Leonardus Polk. He's buried in the church. He was a bishop in the Episcopal Church and one of the most ruthless generals in the Confederate Army and one of the most ruthless slave owners who said, I want my property to stretch from Louisiana to Washington, D.C., where I can walk on my property and never have to get off of. That's why you have all those Polk counties from Louisiana all the way Georgia, Polk County, North Carolina, all the way up. And his uncle or his brother became president. And the folks saw no contradiction when he died in putting his sepulcher under the communion table and his headstone behind the communion table, so that when you acknowledge the cross of Calvary to do communion, or you go to preach the gospel, you have to pay homage to a racist, ruthless slave owner. And last night in that church, I preached because some of the people there are now trying to get from beneath that sorcery. Now, it might take them having to dig up his body,
Or you preaching on top
or letting a few more of us preach on top of it, because normally I preach an hour. But 2 nights ago, since I was standing on top of it, and they had said that he had told folk, if any black person ever preaches in this church, I'm gonna get out of my grave. And I was trying to see, because I know I wanted to see if he could do something. Because if he got up, we could move him, see. So I worked hard the other night to get him to get up. And then we could take that tombstone and all that stuff from under the communion table and get him on up out of there. Well, he didn't get up. But I tried hard, Brother Winslow. For a whole hour I tried. Then I got a second gear. My granddaddy used to preach so long he'd take an intermission. I got a second gear, but he didn't get up. But I hope I pushed him down a little bit further. Or maybe he had a revival and he's changed his mind, and when heaven comes, he'll say, that night you preached at Grace, I was in the grave, but something happened to me. And I repented of all my sins. I don't know. But the deception is so great and so well funded, right? And as Jonathan says, it's why you can't ever believe what they say is really what they're about. Some of them don't even know. Some of the devotees don't even know. They don't even know the money and the stuff that's behind this, you know. I've had people come up to me in tears and say, I didn't know that, and I was raised on this stuff. They don't know. They really are good people. That's why Jonathan and I say, we can't say, I don't even call them my enemies anymore. I refuse to do that, because that means that I don't believe the gospel I preach. And that is that there is redemption possible, right? I might struggle against them, but it's because I love them so deeply that I have to stand up to them. I can't be angry in the sense that my Apache brothers have taught me that hooks me to evil. And I can't look at them and say they're just unredeemable, because I'm a human being too. And every now and then I'm going to get a scratch from the evil one. Does that mean I'm unredeemable?
No.
Okay. Be careful in this moment of cynicism. Even those of you who live in the city and you got a hotel in this city and a name on it, be careful that you do not allow another person, even if he's the president, to drive you to a point of pure hate against them. Fight what they're doing, challenge what they're doing, but the biblical witness would say, don't let them drive you to that point. Yeah.
So, Brother Wenzer, I wanted to continue a little bit both on this connection between systemic racism, white supremacy, and this nationalism, but particularly to really both recognize, you know, how you opened us up, that for 500 years, your religion has not been seen as religion. And yet, the struggle that you're waging at Oak Flat, at Mount Graham, amongst the people, is one about religious freedom. And so I was wondering if you could just speak more to that reality, to the struggle that you're engaged in for religious freedom as a religious freedom struggle, as a struggle, you know, against that supremacy, against that nationalism, and for truth and you know, keeping on this spiritual trail.
I really believe in the beginning, when a child is born, because it's done to every one of us, that when a child is born, that the Creator God, who's known throughout the world by many names, has already placed an essence in you to know already when it's wrong or when it's right. And so during the time before the transition here in America took place, the people, as we were told, were very spiritually strong. They spiritually knew how everything was intertwined and how everything was connected. And I think the way, when I look back, is those important things that were installed in us, rather it be our songs, rather it be from our behavior, our characteristics. We held to it when this transition of racism came into our way of life. And I think the other part of it was that to be able to recognize what this colonization was. And then I think another big part was how the Bible was used against our people.
That's right.
And we can go back during the time when one of the federal policies was to make us, to Christianize us. And on the reservation in the late 1800s, there was an incident that took place because the strategy wasn't taking course and they were upset. And so this was one band of Apaches and another one here. They caused a turmoil between the two. But in that federal policy, what it was that those who ran to the church and those that ran to the sacred mound, those who ran to their sacred ways, their holy ways, go ahead and eliminate them. But those who ran to the church, you know, when they come to you, the soldiers will come and hold the Bible up and say that these are the children of God. And so that's how people began to, some began to convert into that, because it wasn't so much what the Bible was saying, it was the strategy from the federal government, from the government, the military. And so people witnessed that. They didn't forget, they didn't forget, to where it continued to pass on into children. So it wasn't so much who taught it, it was how it was used. And so that's how it really affected in the very beginning. But the only thing that people could hang on to what was originally the religion of this land. And for some people, I explained to them, like when they talk about Mount Sinai, these holy places are no different than that. For what actually you speak of is the same thing we speak of. And when we say our holy or sacred people, in Apache, we call them gone. But in the definition of the English, they gave them the word of crown dancers or devil dancers. The reason why they gave them the word crown was because they do have like a somewhat of a crown that they wear. And then if you ask the question, was what does it do? And as best as they're trying to explain back in the 1800s was, they ward off evil. So, they're devil dancers. So this English word really demised and really watered down the religion of our people. And when in reference that we give today, they may have a picture or they may have a statue and there's a halo. Well, the right words for these, for us, if they want to use the English words, is they were halos. These were angels you're killing. These are the angels you're destroying. No different than the ones you pray to, the ones you talk about. No difference. And so it was really overwhelmed, if you can really think of a people that were being killed. 90% were being killed, exiled out of their homelands, but then they held on to it because it was important, because that was what made us who we are, tied to the world and the greatest gift that God gave the world. And so, I go back and I just, sit and imagine what our people had gone through and how a lot of it had went underground because people were killed for it and were exiled out of Arizona if they continued, to teach. And so there was a really, and I don't think America know what the military did at that time to really go after the Indian people. And so it went underground, and it didn't resurface until around the 1938, 1945, but people were still being punished for it all the way up to the 1970s. So it wasn't until the 1970s before our religious practice really surfaced. And then the next steps now that we're facing is going back to our holy places where these gifts from God originated from. And so, it's something, and we give a lot of gratitude to our women, because it was the women who held on to the religion, because it was the men that were being killed. The men were, because they figure if you take away the father, then how is the young man going to grow? And that was one of the federal policies against Native people. So a lot of our men were eliminated so that the teaching won't continue. But if it wasn't for our women being quiet and quietly teaching, we won't be where we are today, but it really went underground and it came back to surface again. I have to go back to the fact that, we've seen all these things happening. And in Arizona, and only speaking of Arizona, but then speaking for the entire nation, is that where I come from, it's the last place of America, meaning that this was the last place that the United States took over. So we are new and old, meaning we're old to the old ways, and we're new in this transition. That's why we see these things and we can speak of it, and I'm glad you're listening, because, what has happened in Arizona is what happened here in the East Coast.
Sure.
It migrated all the way. And so among the Indian tribes, we are the last. And that's why we're reaching out to all our tribal brothers and sisters out there to bring some of these things back because of that transition that took away. So the atrocities that we went through, they went through it prior, 300 years before us, as America was transforming itself. North America. But anyway, it goes back to just the fact that, it was the identity, and that's why my daughter speaks of, is that we cannot lose our identity.
That's right.
And that's why I tell my daughter, I said, what's so scary, I said, is that I hope we never get to the day that maybe 20 years from today, one of our kids will say to us, what country did I come from? And especially with our holy places being destroyed. So that's why identity is really, really important for all of us, because that's what connects us to the mother, the earth.
And I want to respond in conversation to a couple of things that you said that says why this is so important. So he talked about how one of the things that was taken from indigenous people was, their dance and their religion. In our tradition as African and being both Tuscarora and African American, but among the slaves, it was the Bible, it was the books, the Bible, and the dance and the drum. Those things were made illegal among slaves. Somebody taught you to read, you could be killed, they could be killed. Mm-hmm. The Bible, if they didn't make one without the scripture, they put charcoal and put over all the scriptures of liberation. And then the drum, because they found the drum was a way of calling, gathering, and ascending. And the dance was a way not just of dancing, but of speaking. And also the dancing gave people power in the midst of their oppression. Somehow in the dance they were consumed, if you will, by the righteousness by the power of the Spirit. And those things became eagle, as well as anytime 3 or 4 black people were together, there had to be a white man present, right? Now, when it comes to land, because of Africa, we can't, and that was one thing, one of the reasons for slavery, as you know, in this country, they tried white people, make them slaves. It was called indentured servitude, but originally it wasn't for 7 years. It was for lifetime. That didn't work. They genocide our native brothers, indigenous brothers, sisters, tried to enslave some, but they said, if we're gonna do this slavery thing, we need to be able to totally separate people. And so, as we discuss things today about racism, understand that that wasn't like you came from Africa straight to America, you went to a breaking camps. And the goal in the Caribbeans and other places was to totally break you from culture, dancing, drumming, religion, because it wasn't like folk got introduced to Christianity over here. Christianity was in Africa. It was an African that helped carry the cross of Christ. The last person to have legitimate conversation with Christ was an African. In fact, he was a Libyan, the way we would think of Libya today. Simon of Cyrene. The country we bombed was the last one that carried the cross of Christ and had conversation with him down the Via della Rosa. We're not taught this stuff, right? And so there was this breaking. And some scholars, even some black scholars, agreed that people were totally broken from everything. And by the time they got here, they were what one scholar called a blank slate. But then there were others that said no, because there's some things so deep. And much of it was held, Brother Wednesday, the end of women. I want to be in conversation with that. Sometimes when people work in certain unions and fusion movements, you wonder why in certain communities that particularly people of color, you may have found women who are womanists, but they will not be feminists in the sense, I'm not against feminists, in the sense of being against men. They ain't gonna go there with you. They'll go all the way everywhere, but they're not gonna go there to be my job is to tear down men. Because they know that every oppressor has always sought to destroy the man, if nothing but for the biological reasons of who carries the seed. It ain't got nothing to do with one being over or under or hierarchy. It's something known deep down inside, So my mother is a womanist. God knows she is. Lord knows Liz. My mama's but she's not somebody that destroys. She never felt any need to destroy my manhood. Right? So I want to be in conversation with that, because you heard how he said the women had to hold it. And when you go to Apache land, some people get offended. Some progressives can't go out there with him because you get mad because of something the men still do. You know, all these people, no, you got to know the history. You got to know the history and understand those women ain't being subverted. Those women aren't being submissive. His daughter's very strong. God knows she is. But it's a recognition of we can't do what we already know the oppressor's going to do. Right? Right? The other thing I wanted to mention was that when we talk about where we are today, the first civil war in this country was not the Civil War. It was the Civil War in the churches, which is why we got Northern Presbyterian, Southern Presbyterian, Baptist, Southern Baptist. That was the war, and that war was in the 30s, 1830s and 40s, and it was over the issue of race. And here's one of the arguments we don't often talk about, Liz, and why this stuff is so political, and so religious in terms of the policy racism today. So there was this whole theological argument, and it went like this. Let me see, I'm not being offensive. I need somebody that's of darker skin than me. No, I'm serious. I'm not trying to be ugly. Somebody that's of darker skin. I want to point out something. Come here. This was a whole argument. Yeah. It was a whole argument. Let me have your hand. Is when you look at this black skin, that's clearly black. It doesn't have any extra stuff in it. It's clearly black. Is that the permanent sign of the demonic? That was a debate in the church. Because if that is the permanent sign of the demonic, then we don't baptize. And you can't be a part of our religion. Then it changed. And the question came, well, maybe that's not a permanent sign of the demonic. But if you baptize them to make them, quote unquote, more docile by teaching them our religion and not the authentic Jesus religion, if you baptize this, does their freedom that comes with baptism equate to their political freedom?
That's right.
So they made folk with this skin color say, when they got baptized, have to take an oath before baptism. And the oath had to be, I will be baptized, but I will never equate my baptism as the justification for my freedom. You know how crazy that stuff is? And it was totally, and all this stuff that separated black folk by color and skin and pitted one against the other. But this skin color you see here was a theological debate. And this is how crazy it got them through. The scriptural basis was that in the Garden of Eden, when Cain killed his brother Abel, God put a mark on him and put Cain outside of the Garden of Eden. So the argument by the white supremacists, and it's taught among the Ku Klux Klan, but it ain't just taught there either. It was taught at Harvard. It was taught at Duke. It was taught at Yale. There are books in the stacks that black people carry the mark of Cain. And therefore, by God, were identified prior to birth as being demonic. And therefore, only purpose in this society is for servanthood. Now, here's the craziness. The mark of Cain was put on him for his protection. So even if you were to use that, the exegesis, am I right, Liz? You're a Bible scholar. The exegesis is off. But that's what was going on in the church before the Civil War. And if you know that, then you understand all the other laws that were set in place based on race. And it began before the 1700s with Bacon's Rebellion, when black and white folk joined together, poor black and white folk, to fight together. And the powerful whites said, we got to find a way to separate. Come here. Because we cannot have this. We cannot have this coalition fighting against poverty and against the greedy. So we got to figure a way to separate this from this. So we then declare that this was born as a sign of supremacy. And this was born as a sign of submission, and we write it into law. And all the problems we have today come out of that theological discussion.
So Reverend Barber, you just mentioned exegesis.
Uh-oh.
And I was wondering if you might help us
Say that 3 times, you might cuss.
exegete a couple of the things that these evangelicals of a different good news to the rich
yeah.
are making, right? So we were at a House Budget Committee hearing.
Oh, Lord.
And we had some religion preached at us by some folk that get to make up the budget for this country, including one of the highest ranking members, saying to you,
Yeah.
I'm a Christian. There's a lot of Christianity being thrown around here.
Since he was 8, he was a Christian.
Yeah, that's right. And he said there's nowhere in the Bible where he sees anything, where he's read anything that says that Jesus asked Caesar to care for the poor. That sounded kind of similar to something that not long ago Jerry Falwell Jr. said as he talked about his support for Trump, where it's such a distortion of the teachings of Jesus to say that what he taught us to do personally, to love our neighbors as ourselves, help the poor, can somehow be imputed on a nation. It's a distortion of the teaching of Jesus to say Jesus taught love and forgiveness, and therefore the United States as a nation should be loving and forgiving and just hand over everything we have to every other part of the world. Think about it. Why have Americans been able to do more to help people in need across the world than any other country in history? It's because of free enterprise, freedom, ingenuity, entrepreneurism, and wealth. A poor person never gave anyone a job. A poor person never gave anybody charity, not of any real volume. It's just common sense to me. So I just was wondering if you had a response.
There's a lot in there.
To any part of it.
Yeah. Well, let's go line by line. Let's go line by line. All right. First of all, this man claims first of all, you were there too now. And it was and 4 poor and impacted people of every race, creed, color, and sexuality were there to present a budget for the first time in history where poor people presented their own budget before the budget committee that included numbers for everybody, indigenous people, and so forth and so on. First time. The budget committee. That was after 6 weeks of nonviolent civil disobedience that had happened in 2018, right? 2018. And it was after Congress where over 1,000 people showed up. Now, we go in, and Liz told me to wear my stole that said Jesus was a poor man. Now, before we even get there, remember, in 2018, Liz and I were almost arrested for having on those stoles because the security were told we could not wear any political statement on our thing. And they said if we said Jesus was a man of prayer, it'd be fine. But because we said Jesus was a poor man and we were in poor period, that was too political. And so we said, well, it is. The politics of God ain't got nothing to do with Democrat and Republican, and it's a part of our clothing. So if you want to take that off, then we got to take off our shirt, our underwear, and everything. I mean, sometimes you have to talk as crazy as they talk, right? And I said, so if you are suggesting that nudity is more acceptable than us having on the stove, then we will go on and start debating. He said, no, let me talk to let me talk to the captain. But they literally said we could not go in the gallery of the Senate where a senator might look up there and see that statement. Wow. So we get to the budget committee. And interestingly enough, the Republicans' choice for a person to respond to us were 2 black people. Because the exegesis of that, they already said a poor people's budget, black. Because that's their line. You racialize poverty, you argue it's called positive polarization. That's what Kevin Phillips called it. You go into white communities and you say, you may be poor, but the reason you're poor is because these black folk over here, brown folk are getting everything, and so therefore they are the problem if we stop giving them everything. So they had 2 black people to come and argue that nobody needed to get any help from the government, that the church needed to do it, But they also, in the midst of their testimony, admitted that they had gotten where they are because of help from the government.
And they were also plants.
Plant, right, they were plants. That's right. They were plants, right.
But they weren't, their stories
Weren't even real. Well, that's what that joke, you heard him talk about the deceiver, the joke. So they did that, and then they didn't want to hear people who were truly poor and impacted. They wanted to make it this racialized argument. And so then Liz said something. He really wanted to speak to me. Liz said something. And he got mad with her, but it was my, and he said, I've been up to since I was 8 years old, and I've been taught, and I know what Christian, and this man was sincere. He literally thought that going to church, just saying a little prayer, doing a little communion, asking God to forgive him of all his stuff without any consequences, which the great historian John Hope Franklin said, anybody would take that deal. You know, I committed genocide against a whole people for 500 years, then 400 years I enslaved people, and all I got to do is say, I'm sorry, and that's it? No reparation, nothing? But that's in his essence. He was sincere. This man was sincere, and he was offended that we dared to represent ourselves as having his religion. And so in the midst of that, he started speaking. And he said, I've never read in my Bible. Now here's one example. He was right. The way he was taught the Bible, he would have never read or even surmised that Jesus would have challenged the government. Because when he was taught, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach good news to the poor, he would have taught that meant spiritual poverty. That's what he was taught. Because you can't have Jesus saying the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach good news to the poor, recovery of sight to the blind, deliverance to the captive, and then have soldiers standing up with the Bible saying these are Jesus, but not challenging the whole system that's creating the problem in the first place. So he was right. He was sincerely wrong. But he was right about what he had taught. And he said it with authority. And then he said, the next point, the churches should be fixing this. Which is another thing we have to understand. The deceiver fixes it so people say, you can create public policy that destroys people's lives. And then when it get caught, you don't need a policy fix. You need a few private people to fix it. So the church now has to fix what the church didn't create. And in his mindset, ignore the prophets who always challenge government. Ignore the fact that Jesus' first sermon was a direct challenge to Caesar. Ignore the fact that Jesus' last sermon declared that every nation, including America, would be judged by how it treated the poor, the immigrant, the least of these, the sick, the lonely, and all that. Ignore all of that and just say, if every church will take 5 poor people, 5 poor persons, 5 poor people, and do it. Now, we asked him in turn, we said, wait a minute. We got a problem here bigger than this budget because you just identified yourself with Caesar. Now, that whole history of who Caesar was, but in that, we also heard something. When I get elected to office, with the political power, and many of them using racist voter suppression to do it. When I get elected to office and I get to the highest realm, House of Representatives, Senate, or President, I'm like Caesar, I'm God. Yeah. And how dare you, with your post self, come in here and ask me to change all my beliefs? How dare you come in here and suggest, look how successful I am. I have to be right. Look at where I am. I'm in Congress. I get to vote on a trillion dollar budget. That's power. That's God status. And how dare you come in here? And he's right about that too. Because that's what Jesus did. And it got him crucified. And it will. The other part of that is Jerry Falwell saying what he said. Hear the racialization. When Jerry Falwell, he said poor, he poor because he don't have to say I mean black and brown people. It's so embedded. He's basically saying, why them poor black people don't have to We don't have to give anything to them brown people. Don't have to give them. The poor have never given anybody any jobs. Now, interestingly enough, they have begun now to include poor white folk in some ways of thinking, the hillbillies they call them. Right, and they're especially angry when hillbillies like the ones we met in what was that? Kentucky, but we went to the place where the Dukes of Hazzard. We went to Hazzard County, Kentucky. They really don't like when poor folk from there start hooking up with black folk, and God knows they don't like it when poor white folk from Kentucky and black folk from the South hook up with indigenous people from Arizona. I mean, you just do something wrong. We got to slow this down, right? So Jerry Falwell was spreading that same lie, which is this, and I'm through: the racialization of poverty. But he was also doing something else: the miseducation of America. And the ultimate miseducation is that this country has the wealth it has and the power it has. And this country that's barely 200 and some odd years old could fly past other countries that are 1,000, 2,000 years old, or peoples, nations, indigenous nations, that are thousands of years, that we could in 200 years amass all this stuff just through capitalism and free enterprise, is the greatest miseducation, because it leaves out this: all of it is built on the genocide of indigenous people and the enslavement and free labor of black. You give any nation millions of people 250 years of free labor, and that is the lie that Jerry Falwell inherited from his daddy and inherited right on down. And he now is teaching that. Because here's the thing, the last thing. I was with the AP reporter the other day, and they kept wanting me to talk about Trump's personal failings. And I won't. Because the truth of the matter is, your personal failings, unless you are outwardly hurting people, are between you, your conscience, and your God. But what is legitimately a public discussion is your public policy failures. And so Trump could be a celibate, non-drinking, non-cussing, non-insulting, shake your hand every time you see him, give money to the poor personally. But his policies and those that enable him would still be impure by the standards of God. Because the policies are unjust and oppressive and unkind and unloved and hateful. So you can't judge somebody's morality simply by their personal failures, and sometimes just your own personal, your personal feelings about what they do or how they do something. No. At the end of the day, the question is, are they using their power to feed the hungry and home the homeless and clothe the naked and welcome the immigrant and do justice by the worker? Because no matter how personally fine you are, in the sight of this Bible's political public policy critique, you are a failure as a nation. And that's one of the trickeries of where we're dealing with. Brother Winsley has mentioned it. We got churches on every corner. We have all of this nicety that we've written in, even to the way we open up political meetings. We open up, like today, they opened up the trial with prayer.
That's right.
And somebody, they're so religious. Well, it is a religion, but it ain't the religion of the ultimate creator and the religion of God, because if after that prayer, your policies then pray, P-R-E-Y, on every category of individual that the ethics and example of Jesus or Moses or Muhammad or Abraham or the ethics of the scriptures or the ethic, what'd you call that name, Brother Winslow, the great holy teachers of your faith, of Apache? What'd you say that name? What'd you all call the holy teachers? Say it again? Yeah, right. If it violates those things of love and compassion and caring for the earth and caring for Mother Earth and caring for creation, all this trappings don't mean nothing. That's why the prophets in the Bible, who Jesus rooted his theology in the Bible, said, take away from me the noise of your ceremonies. Get away from me with all the songs, because it sounds like noise and clanging in my ear. If you want to please me, let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. Ain't it amazing, finally, that God equates justice in creation terms? What Brother Winslow been telling us. That if you want to know what God wants, God ultimately wants justice that ain't polluted, that runs as free as a river through the valley, that is as pure as the ocean waves, that is just like creation intended it to be. And if it's not that, it's just pollution. That's all it is. So that was a lot to exegete. I hope I did a little bit. And don't you know, as we fight against what Jerry Falwell is doing, you also ought to be praying for him. Because how deceived must you be to say what she just read?
So when Reverend Barber was talking about fusion, about people coming together, it made me want to have us end, Brother Wensler, with the struggle that you're waging in Oak Flat. And if you have just some more words about how that's taking place and how we have to shine a light and spread that light across this country and world, and just your thoughts, and that will be a blessing to us.
In speaking to people, there's really like as I was saying earlier, there's really like two categories to understand. And the first one I want to attack is the political arena. Never assume like what you hear out there is really what's taking place. I always know that there's something in the back room taking place. In Mount Graham, known as Jitlan Cha Sean, also a home of the spirits, the angels, the deities. In this particular project in the 1988, it had to do with telescopes. And I think a lot of you are hearing about Mauna Kea, what's happening there, with Native people trying to keep telescopes off their holy mound. Well, here in Arizona, there was a proposal for 32 telescopes to be built on this mound, holy mound. And so little did we know who was really involved. And we took a trip actually here to New York. We came here, we flew into New York, and it was all anonymous. We didn't know who we were meeting. We just knew that we were fighting for our holy mound, and we got an invitation to come here and have an opportunity to speak about the holy place. So we get off the plane, they take us to the hotel. They tell us to change our clothing, get ready, and so we go somewhere here. And I'd never been to New York at that time, and we come to this really nice place. And I remember walking into the building, and we were dressed not like the way that people were dressed, and it was very richy, very rich people. But I just remember all the eyes on us and the stare downs that were taking place. So we were like, well, we're supposed to meet somebody here, you know. But nobody walked up to us. We were in there for about an hour. And finally the person that was driving the vehicle comes back in. And he tells me, Mr. Knowsley, it's time to leave. So we're what? So anyway, we get back into the vehicle he had, and he on our way back to the hotel, he tells us, it's time to pack your stuff. You're flying back to Arizona. And I said, wait a minute. I said, we just got here. And he goes, I know. He goes, you guys just did your job. He says, now it's time to get back in your plane and get back to Arizona quick. And he said, we'll call you and tell you more when you get back to Arizona, because we're concerned about your safety. So here we are back on the plane. Got here early in the morning, and then we're back in the plane, the red eye, back to Arizona. So I get to Arizona, and we're, kind of feel used. We were used. And anyway, the call was made, and I'm speaking to somebody I never spoke of. And he told me, he says, Mr. Knowsley, he said, it's time to learn. He said, America is not what America is. He said, there's a lot of things going on behind the scenes. Mm-hmm. And he says, let me tell you, he said, the activity you went to was sponsored by the military. And the United States Congress, or the United States, is involved with the telescope project. Because, as you know, Arizona, the Tucson area, is one that is very strong with their satellites and also with their lasers. He said, there's a war right now going on to who's going to control the world. And he said, there's already satellites set up to where lasers were going to be used through the satellite to hit other countries. And he said, but by you being there, you just exposed that the Native people will fight for their holy and sacred place. So he said, we just got word that the military Air Force is pulling out of the project. So he said, congratulations. Mm-hmm. He said, so he said, you're probably going to see a slowdown. And sure enough, from 32 telescopes, it dropped to 13, and it dropped to 3. And so we're able to keep off the telescopes off our holy mound. But the point is that it was a military decision, a military project. That's right. That was going to take place. But yet every university, everybody in this country were really excited for telescopes, and that what it was going to bring in education and all, the revenue and all that. And the University of Arizona was exempt from all federal laws. Same thing that's happening at Oak Flats today. And so now we're dealing with Resolution Copper, Rio Tinto, who again, a foreign country company, was exempt from all federal laws that you and I, as an Americans, have to abide by. And yet 75% of the minerals are leaving this country. And what's really hypocritical is the fact that you listen to the news and, from the president to Congress, and you hear about their dislikes with China, their dislikes with Iran, and, you hear all these things going on. But what's so crazy right now, and it has not changed, is that 75% of the minerals is leaving this country. And the two big buyers they have is China and Iran.
Yeah.
And I'm like, propaganda to the people of this country. Lying to their own people. Mm-hmm. Making you believe in a system that doesn't exist, so we're all living in some kind of being hallucinated in this way of life that we call American. And yet there's other agendas. That's right. And when it came down to Oak Flats, another big reason John McCain was very interested in the area was because it was supposed to leave a big cavity, and they were going to place the nuclear waste in this mountain and in this holy place. And with Arizona having one of the biggest underground water was going to be contaminated. And not only that, like with what my daughter shared with Barbara and the UN today, was the minerals that they found that is for military weapons. And yet, they put out to this country, revenue, jobs, money, right. Make this country better, stronger. And yet, you got 75% leaving. And, we say, why did God put us on this land, in this particular land to where we have to protect? And when you come down to understanding the Mother Earth, they're all interconnected underneath. There's a purpose. We only tend to look at the top. We don't look underneath. And if we could just go down and look underneath, we'll see how much we've destroyed there too. And we have to be able to come back underneath and understand how everything's intertwined, like I said before. And so on the political sense, you know, as I was saying earlier, that how we've adopted this governmental way, but we're the security of that. We should be protecting those interests. We should hold our congressional people liable for these stuff, and then ask the right questions. A lot of these people, and you know, I've walked the hall of Congress for over 30 years, and to me, I come home and I finally can tell the Indian people back home saying, "Man, I should be Congress. These guys don't care for these guys do not care for this country. They do not care, because if they do care for this country, then they would protect it the way it should be protected." And I said, and that's one of the things that's really disturbing, and that's where we're really deceived, because they don't look at this place as home. You know, they don't look at this place of where it belongs to the next generation and the next generation and how we should maintain this. And so, you know, in the political world, this is what we face. And we all have a say. Everybody in this country has a say. And that's why I said it's very important to make your voice be heard and to have your congressional leadership, you know, support these two bills, because, I mean, the bill in the House and the Senate, because these bills represents the ugliness of this country. You will find everything in this bill that relates to you as well. And if we allow this to happen, then the precedent has been set for the future.
That's right.
But if we argue to this point, you know, and we fight this fight, then, and by a miracle, because like we say right now, it's a miracle we're looking for, that it stops. And this will be a moral victory for every one of us.
That's right.
A spiritual victory for every one of us, keeping the blessed gift alive that God created the world. And this is all of us. Or either we're going to stand by and be a witness of a murder and a killing taking place. So I tell my daughter two things. I said, yes, I said, your dad is there protecting the land. I said, protecting it and also praying that there's a miracle that takes place and this land is saved. I said, but you know what, daughter? I said, the second part of that is the worst part of it. I said, this tells me that people don't know what a killing of an earth is. They don't know what a murder is.
That's right.
I said, so somebody's got to teach this country what they're murdering and what they're losing. I said, because now in the religious way, I said, that's our job, to educate the people of killing an animal, killing the trees, killing water. I said, because there's going to be no tomorrow without that. We cannot survive without any of those things. And then so I speak to a lot of people, and they tell me, in God's way, and even in Jesus' way, it's intertwined. We all have responsibility to take care of these precious gifts. But who segregated it? I mean, they're the same people who segregated us.
Right.
It's their history of how they segregated. And they continue to teach our kids. You know, so we have to wake up and say no more. Because in our Apache way, you're no different than me. You're my sister. You're my brothers. And when the first people came into our region, that's how they were identified. That's your relative. You know, we have no words for hate. You were relatives of ours. But we just didn't know what the first wave of people were looking for. So it makes us wonder that from the first people who came here, who transferred their assets to the next generation, next generation, next generation, next generation, which we live among today of, is that, do they still follow their instructions? Keep everyone divided? Keep everyone separate? Because now we're their biggest fear, because we bring truth. You know, we bring honesty, and we bring a new beginning. You know, we're their biggest fear, because they hold on to that ugliness. And that's why I'm saying it's so important that we come together so that the narrative can change.
That's right. That's right.
With real, in your words, like the gospel, the preaching. In our way, the words,
That's
you know,
right.
of the blessed gift of life.
That's right.
Because they're all one. They're one and the same. And so we're at that crucial point. So when you look at it from a political, you know, position, You see all the ugliness of politics. You see all the ugliness of what is done to all of us. But then when you look at the religious side of it, you know, this holy place is no different than Mount Sinai and all those places
That's
they
right.
talk about in Europe. No different. It's the same God. You don't even have to travel to Europe. You can be here and be a witness to what is God's creation and what is God's words. And this is why, you know, we have come out, you know, began to take that road of spirituality and why, you know, we sit here tonight. Because it's important for all of us. It's important for all your children and our children. And it's important for tomorrow, but with all God's creations. I mean, that's where we are at. And then now even our people tell us that if these people don't listen, then the mother's going to do what it has to do, like all mothers. And that means that we got to prepare. And those who believe in God, those who believe, will be the one to know where to go when that time comes. So even that, we're now preparing ourselves because we don't know. But
That's right.
but we have to pray for that miracle. We have to pray. And that just takes, like what we're doing tonight. You know, it's already started. It's not too late to get in. But the more we can get in together, the bigger difference we're going to make. But like I said, in those two arenas, from the political to the religious, we can do something. I mean, that, and I got to end with, that's kind of the crazy thing, is that it's so simple. It's just simple. It's not even a complicated, you know, discussion or anything, but what makes it complicated is what divides us.
That's right. That's right.
You know, and that's where I started in the beginning, is that trickster, that Lucifer has already come here, but said he would be back. He's back. And that's what we got to wake up to. Because if there's any last spiritual arrow, it's by all of us. Not one of us or one race or anybody. It's all of us. So it's all of us holding it, targeting it, and letting it fly. Wow. And that's the spirit, if we are going to have it tomorrow. So anyway, I just wanted to end with those two, that, you know, the religious side of it is so important. So thank you.
I was telling Liz, I am not convinced that Brother Winslow has not read the entire Bible. Because what he may not know is in the Bible there is a scripture that describes the prophet as an arrow. Now, what you don't know, and I'm not saying I'm the person. I'm not. It's because it's not describing a person. But when I was consecrated bishop, Bishop Flunder said, "Let him now join the arrows." And she preached that scripture, the arrows, who are sent to correct and to change and to change the trajectory of things. We got 127 people or so. I was counting. That's what I was doing a while ago. And so we need a bus from every one of y'all. You don't need all y'all to get on a bus. We need 127 buses at least.
Just from here.
Oh, right, from New York, or more than that.
No, way more.
This, as you all have heard tonight, this event is, we might have thought it was one thing, but it is a generationally transformative event. We don't know how angry this country is going to be by June, how deceived some people will be. And I believe the Spirit is going to use this event with all of us together, and not people speaking on behalf of people, but people speaking on their own behalf, to, in fact, challenge the trickster, challenge the deception, bring some people out of it. It needs to be massive. Not about, me and Liz called it, but if God has used us to sound the trumpet so that everybody can hear the right sound, then so it be it. We don't back up from that. We are thankful for that. But we need you. We had 127 people in here. You know, we need thousands of people on June 20th, 2020 to hear Wednesday, so that it will draw all of the media, C-SPAN, go across the world. If you've ever wanted to have an opportunity to be a part of something that is so necessary, a generationally transformative moment that's a part of a movement, we need you to help us get everybody you can to June 20th, 2020. The Mass Poor People's Assembly, Moral March on Poor People's Assembly, Moral March on Washington. And so Liz is here in New York. They got the New York Poor Peoples. We got them all up and down. We're trying to finish, y'all pray for this now, 15 more stops called We Must Do More to It. And it is hell, not only on the body, but on the mind, because you can't keep going from place to place and seeing all this stuff and pain and not live with it. I know we're having trouble sleeping because we go places and we see people, you know, and their conditions, and we got to go to the next place. But we are seeing people who will brave 9-degree weather because they're so glad finally the issue of pulling poor people and low-income people together is rising, right, in this world. So we're begging you and asking that you do everything you can to get the message out and to make sure there's this large contingency from the Northeast so that the winds can meet together, right? That the winds can meet together, right? Because if there's ever needed a time for a public witness, it is right now, in this moment. And we promise you on that day that the stage will be built primarily for people who will share their stories, but also call for the solution, and will announce that June 2020, the day before the summer solstice, is not an end to the rising. It is just a continuation of the rising. Because the only thing that can deal with the tricksters or Lucifers or whoever, darkness is light. Right? And that's why we choose the summer solstice. We heard yesterday, even in the UN, what the man tell us, he said, yesterday, and this man said, what he said?
He was talking about forces of
darkness. In the UN, he said, let me tell y'all something.
Our meeting with the high-ups in the UN and all
The
over the
forces,
world.
and we didn't use that language. We were trying not to be, you know, we kind of went in and said, because they had told us, well, don't use that language, you know, because in the UN, they don't use that language. And he brought it up. So he was almost like, I'm finally glad some preachers are here. I can say what I really want to say. The forces of darkness. But I heard him
That's right.
say, and basically what he was saying, if you all don't force the meeting in the public square of the believers in light, believe you me, the forces of darkness are not sleeping. They are everywhere, and they're putting pressure on every group, everybody that politically could say no, and they're threatening them. So this witness is more important now than it has ever been in this particular moment of history.
So let's really appreciate the truth that has been shared with us this evening. Let's thank folks for coming and being with us. We were hearing that, that's right. We've been hearing about the power and the funding of the deception. And so the light needs some funding as well, including the light that's at Apache Stronghold. There's a real struggle. And if people can donate to that struggle, it will be used well. There's also T-shirts and patches, information. Will you explain how folk can donate to the Apache Stronghold and to the struggle?
We do have on our webpage where donations can be made. As I was saying earlier, you know, the deadline with the land transfer is going to be in July, so we really got to move publicly, but financially as well too. We're reaching out in every which way to make sure that the appeals are taking place. You know, court hearings are set up, visits to DC to speak to our congressional leaders. So whatever you can do, be grateful. We're real grateful to it. But as Liz said, you know, the struggle's there, the fight's there, and really the deadline to this whole thing is July, that the United States Congress will officially sign over the land to Rio Tinto. So, but again, as I said earlier, the prayers and also reaching out to congressional leaders is a must. And I will be in D.C. Tuesday, so any calls that you guys can make, they'll know I'm there, and it'll be really a big plus. You being constituents to your congressional leaders and you being heard is really going to make an impact. So as my daughter was saying, Bernie Sanders is in the House, and Rahul Gahava in the Senate, and Rahul Gahava is in the House. So those are the two bills, the Save Oak Flat. Thank you.
So find Apache Stronghold online and support the struggle. Before you leave, if you haven't, get a couple more books, get a couple more T-shirts. You can make donations to the Cairo Center. You can donate to the Poor People's Campaign. You can donate to the New York Poor People's Campaign. All of that will bring us closer to June 20th, 2020. All of that will continue to support this grassroots moral movement that is rising up. And so I want to let one of our theomusicologists, Sharon Rebar, close us out in song, but I appreciate people being with us all day today. Appreciate the seriousness with which people approach the topic at hand. And we know that the more we learn, the more we owe. And so let this not be just a day of both hearing about how scary things are going on across this country and world, and also that there's hopeful things, but let us be a part of that hope. And if you're not already incredibly involved in the Poor People's Campaign, A National Call for Moral Revival, there are many people in this room that will find a really important role for you to play. So June 20, 2020.
June 20, 2020. All right. So Brother Wensler talked about walking with him today, and that we are going to make a commitment to walk together, and that we've been talking about going down a different path, right? From this path of hatred and fear and isolation, that we're going down a different path. We're walking toward love. So I want to have you join me in singing this song out tonight and carrying us home and carrying on this pathway with you to D.C., both on Tuesday and beyond. So it says, my mind is made up. I'm on my way up. I'm gonna hold my head up, walking on in love. You try that now. My mind is made up. I'm on my way up. I'm gonna hold my head up, walking on in love. My mind is made up. I'm on my way up. I'm gonna hold my head up, walking on in love. Now you might know this one. I'm on my way to freedom land. I'm on my way to freedom land. I'm on my way to freedom land. I'm on my way. Oh yes, I'm on my way. My mind is made up. I'm on my way up. I'm gonna hold my head up, walking on in love. My mind is made up. I'm on my way up. I'm gonna hold my head up, walking on in love. One more verse. Ain't nothing you can do to turn us around. Ain't nothing you can do to turn us around. Ain't nothing you can do to turn us around. We're on our way. Oh yes, we're on our way. My mind is made up. I'm on my way up. I'm gonna hold my head up, walking on in love. One more, nice and loud, let me hear. My mind is made up. I'm on my way up. I'm going Gonna hold my head up.
All right.
Walking on in love.
Woo!
Thank y'all. June 20, 2020.
June 20.
2020.
June 20.
2020.
June 20.
2020.
Woo!